It began on an ordinary evening in Maple Ridge. In front of the crowd, a police officer raised his boot and kicked a poor young biker girl to the ground. Blood on her arm, shock in her eyes, and phones lifted to record what no one dared to stop. Beside her, a war veteran named Jack and his loyal dog, Rex, stepped forward. None of them knew that what happened in those few seconds would set off a storm that shook an entire town. Before we continue, I want to ask you something. Where are you watching from today? And have you ever witnessed or imagined injustice like this? Share your thoughts in the comments. Let others know they are not alone in believing in kindness and loyalty. And whatever country you are in, I wish you a good day filled with strength and hope. The morning sun rose high over Maple Ridge, pouring light across the wide streets where the weekend fair was already alive with movement. Stalls lined the sidewalks, children darted past carrying paper bags of sweets, and voices overlapped in a constant stream of greetings and sales pitches. Jack Carter, a 42-year-old veteran with a broad frame and steady step, walked slowly through the fairground with Rex, his 6-year-old German shepherd. The dog moved with calm discipline, close to his side, occasionally glancing at the crowd with alert eyes. Jack carried himself with the quiet air of someone who had lived through harder days and found some peace in blending into the rhythm of ordinary life. Near the end of the row of stalls, away from the laughter, a homeless man sat hunched against a wall. He appeared to be in his late 50s, thin and weary, his shoulders bent under invisible weight. His hands trembled slightly as he tried to steady himself, his head lowered while the noise of the fair carried on without him. People passed with quickened steps, some pretending not to see him at all, others turning their faces away. He was there, but to most of the crowd he was invisible, a reminder of what they preferred to ignore. From the corner of the street, a police officer approached with a firm stride. He was tall and broad, around his mid-30s, his expression set in a mask of authority that left no space for sympathy. His eyes swept the scene, pausing on the man seated by the wall. Without hesitation, without warning, he lifted his boot and drove it hard into the man's side. The blow landed with a thud that seemed to silence the fair for a brief second. The homeless man cried out, curling in pain, his body folding against the unforgiving ground. Shock rippled outward, gasps breaking the air, and dozens of phones were raised at once to capture what was happening. In that instant, Lila Monroe stepped forward. She was a young biker, around 28, small but wiry, her posture tense with urgency. Lila had grown up with little, struggling to find her place in a world that often overlooked her, yet she had never learned how to walk away from cruelty. Her instincts overrode fear. She pushed through the startled crowd and placed herself directly between the officer and the man on the ground. The officer's boot swung again, and this time it struck her squarely. The sound of impact cracked the air, her breath caught in a pained cry, and she collapsed to the pavement. Her arm scraped along the ground, blood blooming across her skin, and the crowd erupted in alarm, voices rising in disbelief. Jack reacted before he could even think. He rushed forward, dropping to his knees beside Lila, sliding an arm under her shoulders to help her upright. Her face was pale, her body trembling from the force of the strike, but her eyes still carried a spark of defiance. Rex lowered his head, growling deep from his chest, the sound sharp and menacing. People nearby stepped back at the dog's warning, but no one came forward to help. Jack looked around, waiting for anyone to speak up, but he found only raised phones and silent faces. The officer who had delivered the kick barked into his radio, and within moments, other officers pushed through the crowd. They were men in their 30s and 40s, each moving quickly and decisively, their expressions hard and unreadable. Instead of checking on the injured, they spread out and began shaping the story with their voices. "She attacked him!" one shouted, pointing directly at Lila. Another turned toward Jack, declaring, "This man interfered with police action." The words carried authority, rolling through the air as though simply speaking them made them true. Confusion rippled through the bystanders, who exchanged uncertain looks, some whispering to one another, others retreating into silence. Jack rose halfway, holding Lila steady, but two officers closed in, gripping her arms and yanking them behind her back. She cried out again, this time not from the impact of a kick, but from the sudden twist of her wrists as the cuffs snapped shut. The metallic click echoed sharply, final and merciless. Lila's voice cracked as she tried to protest, insisting she had done nothing wrong, but the officers tightened their grip and ignored her words. Jack tried to shield her, but hands fell on him too, rough and forceful, shoving him down until his knees hit the pavement. Rex barked furiously, straining forward, his amber eyes fixed on the officers pressing his master to the ground. The German shepherd's body shook with tension, every muscle coiled like a spring. One of the officers flinched at the sound, muttering under his breath about needing control of the animal, but none dared to come closer. Even under pressure, Jack shouted a sharp command, and Rex froze, the loyalty in his stillness as powerful as his bark had been. The dog's gaze never wavered, watching every movement with unwavering intensity. Around them, the crowd had grown, the circle tightening as more people arrived to see what the commotion was about. Yet despite dozens of witnesses, no one intervened. Some muttered quietly, their words lost in the noise, while others held their phones higher, capturing every detail from the safety of distance. A few shook their heads, their faces marked by guilt or disbelief, but the majority simply recorded. The truth was there in plain sight, yet it was already being reshaped in the air, carried on the voices of those who held power. Jack's cheek pressed against the pavement as an officer shoved him flat, his chest heavy with both the weight of a knee and the weight of injustice. He looked sideways at Lila, who stood bent forward in restraints, her wrists bound, her breathing sharp and shallow. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and in that connection lay the recognition of what they had both become. Protectors turned into suspects, their courage twisted into accusation. The morning sun still shone bright overhead, but to them, the day had darkened in an instant. The homeless man who had been the first target of violence dragged himself further into the shadows, holding his ribs, his eyes wide and haunted. He whispered faint words of gratitude toward Lila, though the crowd's noise swallowed them before anyone could hear. His presence, the very reason for all that followed, was pushed aside, invisible again as attention fixed entirely on the arrests. Phones continued to film, their silent judgment capturing a version of truth that the officers were already trying to bury beneath their official words. And so, in broad daylight, on a street filled with families and children and the sounds of a weekend fair, the scene twisted into something no one had expected. Jack Carter, veteran, pinned to the ground. Lila Monroe, the poor biker who had stepped forward, forced into cuffs. Rex, the loyal dog, growling low beside them. The crowd stood frozen, recording but unmoving, witnesses to a truth they might not dare to defend. Morning turned into afternoon in Maple Ridge, and the echo of what had happened at the fair still clung to the air like a heavy fog. Jack Carter and Lila Monroe had been taken away in handcuffs, Rex barking until he was silenced, and the crowd had scattered back into the rhythm of daily life as though nothing extraordinary had happened. But the truth of such a scene never stays contained to a single street. Within hours, voices began to shape the story, twisting what had been witnessed into something easier to accept, something safer for those in power to explain. By midday, the first reports appeared on local news sites. A middle-aged news anchor with a polished smile and crisp voice declared the headline with practiced certainty: "Biker causes disturbance at community fair, veteran interferes with police." The words scrolled across screens in bold red letters, their tone final, as though no further explanation was needed. The anchor's calm delivery gave weight to the narrative, while images flashed on the screen. A still frame of Lila struggling with officers, a blurry shot of Jack being held down, Rex's teeth bared in the background. No context was offered, no mention of the homeless man who had been struck first, only the suggestion of aggression and disorder. The story spread quickly across radio and online platforms. Headlines repeated the same phrases with slight variations. Local biker assaults officer. Veteran disrupts peace. Each repetition hardened the lie, giving it more permanence, until those who had not seen the truth firsthand were left with little reason to doubt. In coffee shops and diners, people shook their heads as they scrolled through their phones, muttering judgments shaped entirely by what they read. Some called Lila reckless, others wondered aloud why a veteran like Jack would risk his reputation by intervening. Clips appeared on social media soon after, each trimmed carefully to show only the moments that supported the official story. The shaky video showed Lila lunging forward, colliding with the officer, but cut away before revealing the raised boot or the defenseless man on the ground. Another clip showed Jack rushing in, his hand reaching for Lila's shoulder, but froze before the camera could capture her bleeding arm or the officer's second kick. Comment sections filled with accusations, some viewers typing furiously about lawless bikers or disgraced soldiers, their words feeding a narrative already constructed by headlines. In a small newsroom on the edge of town, a young intern named Rachel sat at her desk, scrolling through the clips. She was 23, fresh from college, her round face framed by a neat ponytail, and her eyes bright with a hunger for real stories. She had grown up in Maple Ridge, knew the streets and the people, and something in her gut told her the official line was incomplete. "This doesn't add up," she whispered to herself, replaying one of the shortened clips over and over, catching the faint sound of a crowd gasping just before the cut. But she was too new, too unproven, and when she raised her doubts to her editor, he waved them away, telling her to stick with the press release. The distortion might have remained unchallenged if not for an anonymous hand. Late that evening, a new video surfaced, grainy but longer than the others, posted under a nameless account on social media. It began earlier than the other clips, capturing the moment the officer's boot swung toward the homeless man. Gasps filled the background, the lens shaking as the person holding the phone reacted. The video then showed Lila rushing forward, taking the blow in place of the man, her fall sharp and painful. Jack entered the frame, helping her up, Rex growling low as the officers closed in. It was raw, unedited, and undeniable. At first, the video spread quietly. A few local groups shared it, pages dedicated to veterans, bikers, or social justice. Comments trickled in. "This is different from the news story. Why did they cut this part?" But with each share, the truth grew louder. A teenager reposted it on a popular platform, writing, "They lied to us, watch this full clip." Within hours, hundreds had seen it, then thousands, each person drawn to the stark difference between what had been told and what had been hidden. By midnight, hashtags began to emerge. #justice for Lila appeared first, pushed by a small biker community who recognized her name and her history of helping those around her despite her own struggles. Soon after, #FreeJack followed, shared by a veterans forum outraged at seeing one of their own portrayed as a criminal. The tag spread like wildfire, climbing into trending lists, bringing strangers into the conversation who had never heard of Maple Ridge before that day. Crowds returned to the video again and again, scrutinizing every second. They saw the way the officer's kick connected before Lila ever touched him, the way the homeless man recoiled, the way Jack's only action had been to shield and support. The comments shifted from skepticism to outrage. People demanded explanations. Some tagged news outlets, asking why the original footage had been cut. Others called for accountability, their words heavy with anger that such truth could be so easily buried. Rachel, the young intern, watched the spread from her phone long after leaving the newsroom. Her doubts had been confirmed, but more importantly, she realized the power no longer sat only with the press. It rested with the thousands of people willing to share, to repost, to keep pushing until silence was no longer possible. She whispered again, this time with certainty, "This isn't over." Though she had no control over the story her station told. She knew that the truth was already breaking free beyond their reach. The morning after, Maple Ridge awoke to a divided reality. The newspapers still ran their bold headlines. The television anchors repeated their practiced lines. But online, the narrative had shifted. The hashtags glowed on screens across the country, drawing attention that local officials could no longer ignore. In diners and offices, people argued over which version to believe. Yet the evidence was out there, undeniable to those who watched with open eyes. And so, the distorted truth began to unravel, not through institutions or officials, but through the unfiltered lens of one anonymous recording. Jack Carter and Lila Monroe still sat in custody, their names smeared in headlines. But beyond the walls that held them, voices were rising. The world had seen more than what was intended, and the call for justice was only beginning. Night settled over the highways stretching beyond Maple Ridge, the kind of night where truck stops glowed under harsh fluorescent bulbs and roadside bars pulsed with low music and the hum of conversation. The story of Jack Carter and Lila Monroe had already reached televisions and radios, but in these roadside corners where bikers gathered, it was the raw, uncut video playing on cracked phone screens that carried the most weight. Men and women in worn leather jackets leaned over tables, faces illuminated by the bluish glow, their silence heavier than any music coming from the jukebox. In one such bar, a group of bikers sat hunched around a scarred wooden table. Most were in their 30s and 40s, broad-shouldered and weathered from years on the road. One, a gray-bearded rider with piercing eyes, replayed the clip again and again, the sound of the officer's boot striking ringing in his ears. Across from him, a younger rider muttered, "That's Lila." His voice carried a mixture of disbelief and anger, because every man at that table remembered the girl who had patched their bikes at midnight or slipped them a meal when money was short. Lila Monroe wasn't just another face on a screen. She was part of their world, and seeing her thrown down in chains hit deeper than any headline. More bars echoed with the same recognition. In a dim corner booth, a woman with braided hair whispered, "She once fixed my clutch for nothing, wouldn't even take gas money." Another man recalled, "She helped me haul my brother's bike after it broke down outside town. Stayed until dawn." The stories rippled out, small acts of kindness that had seemed forgettable at the time but now burned with new meaning. The injustice was no longer abstract. It carried the name and face of someone who had given without asking, someone who had earned loyalty without ever demanding it. The anger built slowly, like an engine warming before the roar. A broad man with tattooed arms slammed his fist against the table, making bottles rattle. His words cut through the smoky air. "If they can do this to her, they'll do it to any of us. Today, it's Lila. Tomorrow, it's one of our brothers, or our sisters, or all of us." The room fell quiet, not in fear, but in agreement, every face nodding with the weight of what he said. Loyalty, once dormant, flared alive in that silence. Calls began to spread from one bar to another, carried not by official networks but by voices over phones and the trust of shared bonds. Old numbers were dialed, brief words exchanged, the message clear and urgent. Riders finished their drinks in silence, dropped crumpled bills on tables, and walked into the night. Engines turned over with deep growls, headlights blinking awake, chrome catching the glow of neon. The bars that had been filled with low music were left nearly empty, their parking lots shaking as rows of motorcycles pulled onto the highway. By midnight, the highways that cut across the state thundered with convoys of Harleys. Dozens became scores, and scores threatened to become more. From different towns, from different lives, they rode in unison, their taillights stretching in long red rivers through the dark. Truckers slowed to watch the endless formation pass, their radios buzzing with speculation, but the bikers didn't need to speak. Their engines carried the message louder than words. They were heading to Maple Ridge. Inside the county jail, the air was still and heavy. Jack Carter sat on a narrow bench in his cell, his shoulders hunched, but his gaze steady. He had faced worse in combat, but there was something uniquely bitter about being treated like a criminal for doing what conscience demanded. In another cell nearby, Lila leaned against the wall, her arms still raw from the scrape, her eyes fixed on nothing. She was tired, but behind the exhaustion burned a stubborn fire, the refusal to bow. Rex was chained in the yard, the concrete cold beneath his paws, the chain taut against his collar. His ears flicked at every sound, his muscles tense, his amber eyes glowing under the faint light. When the first distant rumble of engines carried across the night air, his head snapped up. The growl in his chest built into a bark, sharp and commanding, echoing against the walls of the compound. The guards cursed at him, muttering about the damn dog, but Rex didn't stop. His instincts told him what no man could. Something was coming, something powerful and relentless. The sound grew closer with every passing minute, a low vibration that reached through walls and concrete, carrying into the cells. Lila lifted her head, her breath catching, her eyes narrowing as though she could already sense what Rex had heard. Jack, too, looked toward the barred window, his soldier's ears trained to recognize the rhythm of engines in formation. Neither spoke, but both knew this was no ordinary night. In the stillness of Maple Ridge, the town that had dismissed the poor and condemned the loyal, the ground began to tremble under the weight of loyalty long suppressed. What had started as whispers in roadside bars had become a storm rolling toward the heart of the town, and even behind bars, Jack, Lila, and Rex could feel the pulse of it. The clock had just passed midnight when the first vibrations reached Maple Ridge, low and steady, a sound that seemed to roll out of the horizon itself. The town, normally quiet at such an hour, began to stir as curtains twitched and lights flicked on in small homes. Those awake leaned toward their windows, trying to make sense of the thunder rising in the distance, a thunder without clouds. Then the glow of headlights appeared, long and unbroken, cutting through the night as nearly 70 bikers rode in formation. The roar of their engines filled Main Street, but there were no reckless revs, no shouts of bravado. Instead, there was discipline, the kind of order that carried weight heavier than chaos. They turned together with precision, slowing as they approached the police station, a squat concrete building that loomed over the square. Harley after Harley lined the curb, headlights burning bright, until the street itself seemed bathed in white fire. The bikes were parked side by side, their bodies forming a barricade, a wall of steel that gleamed under the streetlights. Residents who had gathered on sidewalks whispered in disbelief. Some clutched their phones tighter, others live-streamed what they were witnessing, their voices hushed as if speaking too loud might break the spell. A child whispered to her mother, "Are they here to fight?" But the answer became clear almost immediately. There was no shouting, no fists raised, no bottles broken, only silence, broken by the steady hum of dozens of engines, the rhythm echoing like a single heartbeat across the square. Inside the station, the officers on duty crowded toward the windows. Their faces were pale, their voices rising with unease. One younger officer muttered that it looked like a siege, while another insisted they should rush out and disperse the bikers. But the older men stood back, sensing the weight of what was happening. This wasn't a riot, and it wasn't disorder. It was something harder to confront. Protest without words, power without chaos, the kind of defiance that exposed weakness more than violence ever could. At the front gate, two bikers stepped forward. Both were in their 40s, tall and broad, their movements deliberate. One carried a length of heavy chain slung over his shoulder, its steel links clinking in the quiet night. The other dragged a second coil behind him, his jaw set with grim determination. Without speaking, they approached the iron gates of the station. Cameras tilted to capture them, the glow of live streams spreading from phones in every direction. They looped the chains through the handles, pulling them tight, then snapped padlocks shut with sharp final clicks. The sound carried like a gavel through the square, final and binding. Inside, officers pressed against the bars, their voices rising in outrage, but the bikers did not respond. The chains hung heavy, glinting in the headlights, turning the jailhouse into its own cage. The symbolism was brutal and brilliant, a reversal that everyone watching understood instantly. The ones who had caged others now found themselves sealed within, not by bars of law, but by the will of those who had come to stand against them. In his office, the police chief gripped his phone with trembling hands. He was in his 50s, stocky and usually confident, but tonight his forehead glistened with sweat. His call to the state headquarters was answered by a weary voice, and he demanded reinforcements. Yet the reply came sharp and firm. No units would be sent. The incident was already live across the country, millions watching the streams under a single surging hashtag, number sign locked from outside. Sending more police would only feed the fire. The chief slammed the receiver down, his voice breaking as he cursed under his breath. Across the square, the bikers stood in rows, arms folded, their faces set in silence. Some were young, restless energy visible in their clenched jaws, while others were older, their eyes reflecting years of weathered battles, both on roads and in life. Yet all stood together, united not by orders but by loyalty, their presence louder than any speech. The crowd on the sidewalks grew, emboldened by the sight, whispering words of support, recording from every angle. The town itself was becoming a stage, and the whole nation was the audience. In the yard, Rex tugged against his chain, ears pricked, his body rigid with anticipation. The growl in his throat became sharp barks as the sound of engines pressed through the walls. His eyes gleamed under the faint lights, as if he too understood the meaning of what had arrived. Lila, sitting on the floor of her cell, heard the echoes and lifted her head, a small smile touching her bruised face. Jack across the corridor leaned forward on the bench, recognizing the sound of solidarity even through layers of stone and iron. Neither spoke, but both felt the weight of the moment. The square pulsed with tension, each second stretching as the bikers remained unshaken. The police inside scrambled with radios, demanding guidance, but none came. The cameras outside streamed continuously, comment feeds bursting with words of awe, outrage, and support. The silence of the bikers spoke volumes, each steady engine note a reminder that loyalty had taken shape, that the balance of power could tilt without a single punch thrown. And so, as Maple Ridge held its breath, the jail stood sealed not by force of law, but by chains on its own gates, bound by the will of nearly 70 riders who had chosen to lock the system from the outside. The chains still clung to the gates when the decision finally came, not from the police chief, but from pressure rising beyond his office walls. Across the country, screens glowed with the sight of 70 riders standing guard, their silence louder than orders, their presence impossible to dismiss. Reporters whispered into their microphones, their voices trembling with the weight of history, while online feeds blazed with hashtags that refused to fade. Inside the jail, Jack Carter and Lila Monroe waited in stillness, the sound of Rex's steady bark carrying hope into their cells. Then, as dawn threatened the edge of the horizon, the locks inside the building turned and the heavy doors began to creak open. The crowd outside held its breath. The riders shifted slightly, not to move forward but to part, their motorcycles angled with precision. Headlights flared bright, cutting through the shadows, forming two unbroken lines that stretched across the square. Between them lay a path glowing in steel and light, not a road of asphalt but a corridor of honor carved from loyalty. People standing on rooftops and sidewalks raised their phones higher, some with tears streaming down their cheeks, others whispering prayers they didn't know they still remembered. From the open doorway, Jack emerged first. His 42-year-old frame carried the weight of exhaustion, but his step was steady, his gaze unbroken. At his side padded Rex, the German shepherd, his ears pricked, his coat catching the beams of headlights like burnished gold. The dog's eyes swept the corridor, his tail stiff, but his body relaxed, as if he understood this was not a battlefield, but a moment of respect. Behind them walked Lila, younger and smaller, but every bit as defiant. Her bruises still showed, her arm bore the scrape from the pavement, yet her posture carried strength that silenced doubt. The riders stood unmoving, helmets tucked beneath arms or resting on handlebars, their faces solemn in the glow. Not a word passed between them, not a shout or chant, only the reverberation of engines idling in harmony, a rhythm that filled the air like a hymn. The crowd erupted softly at first, a wave of cheers rising, parents lifting children onto shoulders so they could see, strangers hugging one another as if the burden of silence had finally broken. In the middle of that corridor, Jack, Rex, and Lila walked forward, each step slow, deliberate, and unyielding. From the edge of the crowd, a child broke through, no older than 7, his face pale with awe but his hands clutching a folded paper. A woman called after him, but he kept moving, weaving between the rows of riders until he reached Lila. She knelt, lowering herself despite the pain in her body, and the boy pressed the drawing into her hands. On the page, in crude lines of crayon, stood 3 figures: a soldier with a crutch, a biker girl with a streak of red on her arm, and a dog with bright eyes. Lila's throat tightened as she traced the lines with her fingertips, the innocence of the gift cutting deeper than any speech could. Her voice, rough with emotion, carried enough for those closest to hear. "The poor may have nothing," she said, her words trembling but firm. "But we still have kindness, and that is enough to change a town." A hush fell over the front rows, then spread outward, until even the reporters lowered their microphones and simply listened. The boy smiled shyly and returned to the crowd, his small act echoing across the square as if it had been carved into stone. Tears glistened in the eyes of strangers who had never met Jack or Lila, people who had walked past the homeless without notice just a day earlier. An older woman pressed her hands together, whispering that she had lived long enough to think loyalty was gone, but tonight had proved her wrong. A man in work clothes wiped his face and said to no one in particular, "This is what respect looks like." The corridor, bathed in light, had become more than a gesture. It had become a mirror for a community rediscovering its soul. As Jack and Lila reached the end of the path, the riders shifted again. Helmets lifted, engines roared in unison, not with chaos but with deliberate timing, a salute of thunder that shook the glass of storefronts and rattled the hearts of everyone watching. The sound carried not as defiance but as promise, a declaration that loyalty could not be silenced, that dignity would not remain chained. Jack placed a hand on Lila's shoulder, Rex standing tall beside them, and for a moment the three stood together at the heart of Maple Ridge, bound not by circumstance but by shared courage. Then, as suddenly as they had arrived, the bikers began to mount their machines. Kickstands folded, leather creaked, engines roared once more, and the rows turned outward. No one gave orders, yet every rider moved as though part of a single mind. They rolled forward slowly, headlights cutting into the breaking dawn, their silence restored, leaving only the echo of their presence behind. The crowd parted respectfully, applause and cheers following them as they disappeared into the horizon. Maple Ridge would never forget that night. The chains on the jailhouse, the corridor of light, the roar of engines that honored loyalty rather than fear, all of it burned into memory. The town square, once just another patch of asphalt, had become sacred ground. And as the last echo of motorcycles faded, the people who remained knew they had witnessed something rare, something that would be told for years, a moment when kindness and courage carried by the poor, the forgotten, and the loyal reshaped the heart of an entire community. At the heart of this story lies a simple truth. Kindness and silent sacrifice can carry more power than fear or force. A poor biker girl, a veteran, and a loyal dog reminded a whole town that dignity is not measured by wealth or authority, but by the courage to protect one another when no one else will. Their act of compassion became a spark that turned silence into loyalty and loyalty into change. Take a moment to share this story with someone who needs to believe in kindness again. Leave a comment with what this story makes you think about, and subscribe so you do not miss the next tale of courage and hope. May God bless you and those you love, and may He keep your heart strong with compassion.